History is full of these really dark ironies, but there's one that always kind of sticks with me.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so it starts with a young man, a naturalist. He's just, floating around the Pacific on a ship with this incredibly benign name, the HMS Beagle.
Right, the famous voyage.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And he's out there sketching tortoise shells, he's collecting beetles, he's just obsessing over the beak shapes of
It's
finches.
doing pure science.
Pure science.
Yeah.
It's the ultimate picture of peaceful scientific curiosity. And yet, the observations made on that very boat trip would eventually be weaponized.
Utterly weaponized.
They'd be twisted into ammunition for some of the most violent, destructive ideologies of the modern era. We're talking about the justification for global empires, the quote-unquote scientific backing for racism, and really the rationale for the massive geopolitical conflicts of the 20th century.
It is a totally jarring disconnect when you look at it. You have Charles Darwin, a man who was, by all accounts, quite gentle and retiring,
Very private guy, yeah.
producing work that would later be used to justify things like the scramble for Africa and the horrors of the First World War. But that is exactly what our deep dive is about today.
Yeah, we have a really fascinating source deck to get through.
We do. We are looking at a source analysis titled Natural Selection and the Evolution of Social Hierarchy. And it specifically focuses on AP European History topic 7.4.
And for those of you listening right now who might be thinking, oh, I know Darwin, survival of the fittest, I got it. We really need to hit the pause button.
Because the story isn't actually about the biology.
No, not at all. It's about the mutation of an idea. We're tracing the path from a biological theory about finches to a political doctrine about human inequality. So the mission today is to understand how we got from point A, which is the science, to point B, which is social Darwinism.
And that mutation you just mentioned is the critical part for you to keep in mind, because ideas don't exist in a vacuum. When a scientific theory enters the public consciousness, it gets filtered. It gets filtered through the biases, the politics, and the needs of the society that receives it.
Like a game of telephone, but with global consequences.
Exactly. In this case, we are looking at how Victorian society took a theory about survival in the wild and used it to explain and essentially excuse their own social structure.
So let's set the stage with the man himself. Charles Darwin. We all know the headline, right? On the Origin of Species.
Sure.
But looking at the source material, his background is actually quite relevant to why his ideas caused such a massive shockwave. I mean, he wasn't this atheist radical trying to burn down the church.
Far from it, actually. Darwin was educated at Cambridge in theology.
Theology. I feel like people always forget that.
They do. He was steeped in the traditional worldview of the early 19th century, and that worldview was defined by the act of creation.
The literal interpretation of Genesis.
Right. The prevailing belief was that the world and all its plants and animals were created by God out of nothing. They were perfect and they were immutable, created in a single divine act.
Which makes that HMS Beagle voyage so pivotal. Because he goes to the Galapagos, he goes to South America, and he's observing these, the text calls them pristine ecosystems.
And he realizes that the act of creation narrative just doesn't fit the raw data he's collecting.
The animals aren't immutable.
No, they change. They adapt over time. He sees that nature is actually a brutal, competitive arena. It's not a peaceful garden at all.
It's a struggle for resources.
A constant struggle. And in that struggle, individuals with traits that are best suited to their specific environment are the ones that survive and reproduce.
Natural selection.
That is the core mechanism of natural selection, yes.
And what's wild is that he sits on this idea for decades, right? I mean, On the Origin of Species doesn't even come out until 1859.
He knew exactly how explosive it was going to be. And when it finally dropped, it fundamentally shifted the intellectual landscape of Europe.
It was an earthquake.
It really was. It moved society toward secularism, toward positivism and materialism. It basically replaced theological explanations with empirical evidence.
And this is a massive, but for our deep dive today, in 1859, Darwin was very, very careful to keep the focus entirely on plants and animals.
He did not want to touch the human question yet.
No. But the implication was hanging there in the air. If the finch evolves and the tortoise evolves...
Then what about us?
Exactly. What about us?
And the shoe didn't officially drop until 1871. That was with the publication of The Descent of Man.
That's the turning point.
That's where Darwin explicitly applies these evolutionary principles to human beings. He suggests that we evolved from lower animal forms.
And that was the psychological break for society.
It completely removed humanity from its special pedestal. Suddenly, we weren't fallen angels anymore. We were risen apes.
Which creates this huge vacuum, because if we aren't divinely ordered by a creator, then how should society be ordered? If the laws of nature are just struggle and competition, does that mean our human society should be a struggle too?
That right there is the moment the virus enters the system.
Yeah.
This is where we pivot from Darwinism, the pure science, to social Darwinism, the ideology. And strangely enough, the villain of this part of the story, or at least the main architect, isn't Darwin at all.
It's Herbert Spencer.
Enter Herbert Spencer.
Spencer is such a fascinating figure because in his time, he was arguably more famous than Darwin. He was this superstar British philosopher. And I think a lot of people today actually attribute the phrase survival of the fittest to Darwin. But that was Spencer, wasn't it?
It was absolutely Spencer. He coined that phrase after reading Darwin's work, and then Darwin actually adopted it in his later editions.
Wow.
But Spencer was doing something very different with it. He wasn't looking at beetles or finches. He was looking at the British class system.
Right. Applying biology to sociology and economics.
Yes. He proposed this concept called the society as organism analogy. It's the argument that human societies evolve and operate exactly like biological organisms.
Okay, let's really dig into this society as organism concept for a second. Because it sounds like a nice, neat metaphor, but the implications are pretty dark.
It's very seductive because it feels so logical. Spencer argued that just like a physical body has different systems that need to function efficiently, a society has different classes.
Okay.
And just as nature naturally prunes away the weak cells or the unadapted organisms, society must allow its weak members to fade away so the strong can thrive.
Fade away. That is a very, very polite euphemism for starve.
It is a brutal concept. But you have to understand why this became so incredibly popular. Think about the context. This is the height of the Industrial Revolution. You have this rising class of extremely wealthy industrialists, and right next to them you have massive grinding poverty in the cities.
Slums, child labor, all of it.
Exactly. And Spencer comes along and essentially says, hey, this inequality isn't a failure of our politics. It's just a law of nature.
That is the ultimate intellectual shield, isn't it?
It really is.
If I'm a factory owner and I'm paying my workers starvation wages, I don't have to feel guilty anymore. I'm just an agent of natural selection. I'm simply the fittest.
It totally legitimized the status quo. It transformed rapacious capitalism into biological destiny.
Wow.
According to this logic, if the poor are poor, it's because they lack the fitness to succeed. So helping them through welfare or charity would actually be unnatural.
Because you're messing with the natural order.
Right. It would involve propping up the weak and dragging down the strong, which would weaken the entire social organism.
It is incredibly convenient logic for the people on top. It literally turns cruelty into a virtue. You're not being heartless. You're just being a good guardian of the species' future.
And this brings us to the real twist mentioned in our source material. This pseudoscientific rationalization didn't just stay contained to economics and class.
It mutated again.
It mutated again.
Yep.
If you can categorize rich and poor as fit and unfit, it is a very short, very dangerous step to categorizing entire races the exact same way.
This is where the story gets so much darker. We move from class warfare to racial ideology. And the key figure, or source highlights here, is Houston Stewart Chamberlain.
Yes.
Now, his background is a bit bizarre. He's a British-born guy who moves to Germany and becomes, effectively, a German racial nationalist.
Chamberlain is the bridge to the true horrors of the 20th century. He took Spencer's vague ideas about societal strength and he started applying them to specific racial groups.
Right.
He became completely obsessed with the idea of the Aryan.
The Aryan theory. He argued that the Germans were the pure ancestors of this master race, right?
Yes. He claimed they were the true creators of Western culture. But the most dangerous part of Chamberlain's logic, and this is absolutely crucial to understand, was the exclusionary aspect.
The demand to eliminate the lesser influences.
Exactly. If the German or Aryan stock is the source of all civilization and strength, then other races aren't just different, they are active contaminants.
It changes the entire dynamic from competition to elimination.
That's the terrifying shift. In the animal kingdom, a lion doesn't hate the gazelle, it just eats it to survive. But in Chamberlain's racial ideology, the quote-unquote lesser races were viewed as an active biological threat to the purity of the strong.
And the source material specifically mentions the groups targeted by this rhetoric, right?
Yeah.
Jews, Asians, and Africans.
Yes. The logic was that to protect the social organism, you had to excise the threat.
You can see the direct straight line to the rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazi racial doctrine right here. It's chilling. It's using the vocabulary of science words like hygiene, purity, genetics
Yeah.
to justify institutionalized hate.
It creates a framework where empathy is seen as a weakness. If you genuinely believe you are fighting a biological war for the survival of your race, then having compassion for the other is actually a betrayal of your own kind.
And this wasn't just theoretical stuff being debated in academic parlors. This was happening on the global map. We have to talk about the scramble for Africa.
This is the global application of social Darwinism. European powers were aggressively carving up the African continent, and they needed a justification for it.
Because they couldn't just tell their citizens, hey, we're going in to steal their golden rubber. They needed a moral mandate.
And social Darwinism provided that mandate perfectly, this civilizing mission.
Right, the idea that imperialism wasn't aggression.
If you view nations as biological entities, then the strong nations have a natural right, even a duty to dominate the weak ones. Imperialism was seen as the natural order of things taking its course.
I mean, I've read about how they used things like craniometry, literally measuring the sizes of skulls during this period, to try and scientifically prove that colonized peoples were biologically inferior.
It was a pervasive pseudoscience.
It's that same desperate need to put a scientific stamp of approval on oppression.
They used these theories to classify entire populations as childlike or arrested in development, and that justified taking over their land, stripping their resources, and exploiting their labor. In their minds, they were just managing the weaker species.
But there's another side to this coin that I found really striking in the sources. If you truly believe that struggle is the engine of human progress, what does that say about peace? Because normally, you and I think of peace as the ultimate goal for society.
Well, in the social Darwinist worldview, peace is highly suspicious. Peace looks like stagnation. If nature only progresses through conflict, then a nation that isn't actively fighting is a nation that is getting soft.
That is a terrifying reframe. War becomes healthy.
That is exactly how they saw it. War was viewed as a biological necessity for progress.
A necessity.
Yes, it was the ultimate stress test for a society. It supposedly winnowed out the weak elements of the population and forged this strong national unity. You actually had military leaders and politicians in the early 1900s speaking publicly about war as a cleansing force, something to be welcomed, not avoided.
So instead of trying to avoid conflict, these great powers of Europe were almost itching for it. They viewed the coming war not as a tragedy, but as the ultimate test of their fitness.
And that mindset just poured gasoline on the fires of nationalism. You had these rival empires, Britain, Germany, France, all entirely convinced of their own biological superiority.
And all convinced that a clash was inevitable.
A great war was seen as necessary to prove once and for all who was truly the fittest.
It really reframes how you look at the build-up to World War I. We always talk about the complex alliances and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
The spark, sure.
Right, the spark. But underneath all that political maneuvering was this deep ideological current that basically said, we need this fight.
It explains the massive enthusiasm we saw early on. Remember the historical images of young men cheering in the streets as they marched off in 1914?
Yeah, smiling, throwing flowers.
They thought they were participating in this glorious natural process of selection. They had absolutely no idea they were walking into a mechanized slaughterhouse that would make a complete mockery of the idea of individual fitness.
Because a machine gun doesn't care how biologically fit you are.
Exactly. Artillery shells don't select for the strongest traits.
That is the ultimate irony of this whole thing, isn't it? They used biology to justify a war that ended up destroying a whole generation of their best and brightest.
It violently dismantled the very social organism they claimed they were trying to strengthen.
So when we step back and look at this entire trajectory, going from Darwin's finches on the Galapagos to the muddy trenches of the Somme, it's honestly overwhelming.
It's a huge arc.
We have a scientific observation that was originally intended to explain the diversity of life, and it ends up being the exact tool used to justify the destruction of it.
It really is a perfect case study in the profound power of scientific ideas to reshape society, which is exactly how our source concludes its analysis.
Yeah.
But I think the vital takeaway here for you listening is about distortion. Darwin gave humanity a brilliant mechanism for understanding the natural world, but he didn't give us a moral handbook.
But people really, really wanted one. They wanted science to tell them what was definitively right and wrong.
And that is the trap. Science can tell us what is. It can explain how a virus spreads through population or how a star forms in a galaxy.
Right.
But it cannot tell us how to treat our neighbors. It cannot tell us how to ethically structure an economy. When thinkers like Spencer and Chamberlain tried to force biology to answer those complex moral questions, they created a monster.
It makes you realize that the word natural is a very dangerous word in politics.
Oh, absolutely.
Whenever someone stands up and argues that a certain social hierarchy is just natural, or that extreme inequality is just the natural order of things, alarm bells should be going off in your head.
Without a doubt. Because usually what they are calling natural is just the specific system that benefits them the most.
It's an appeal to an authority that you supposedly can't argue with.
Right, you can argue with a tax law, you can't argue with biology, or at least that's the ideological trick they try to pull on you.
So, the lesson here for us today isn't just about Victorian history or World War I. It's about how we consume information right now. Because we are living in a golden age of science, right? Genetics, neuroscience, artificial intelligence.
We're learning more about what makes us tick than any generation before us.
Exactly.
And the temptation to use that new data to justify social policies will be just as strong today as it was for Herbert Spencer in 1880.
You already see it.
You do. You see it in debates about intelligence testing or crime statistics or gender roles. People constantly grasped for a scientific study to validate their pre-existing worldview.
So our job, really, your job as the listener, is to constantly distinguish between the actual scientific fact and the ideological use of that fact.
We have to critically ask, is this actual peer-reviewed science, or is this just social Darwinism dressed up in a new costume?
Are we using this knowledge to uplift humanity, or are we using it to categorize and dismiss certain parts of it?
Because if we don't ask those hard questions, we risk repeating the exact same cycle. We risk letting our tools master us instead of the other way around.
And as this deep dive shows, the historical cost of that mistake is catastrophically high.
Millions of lives high.
It's a really heavy topic, but a necessary one to explore. It completely changes how you look at the history books. I mean, it wasn't just cartoonishly bad people doing bad things. It was highly educated, smart people who were completely convinced they were doing the modern scientific thing.
Which history tells us is often far more dangerous.
Well, on that provocative thought, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. It's a stark reminder that critical thinking is probably the most important survival trait we actually have.
I couldn't agree more. Keep questioning everything.
Thanks for diving in with us today. We'll catch you on the next one.